What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Legends of the Dugout. I'm Dave, and I'm here with a special guest of mine. He's an author of a book called Pete Browning, the original Louisville Slugger. His name is Tim Newby, and I'm going to bring him in, and he's going to discuss the book that he wrote. So, thank you, Tim, for doing this, and I'll give you the stage, and then I'll bring up your slides when you want me to.
Thanks for having me. It's always fun to come on and talk some baseball and talk some Pete. So I guess the best place to kind of start with is how did you decide to write a book about a 19th century baseball player? So a little backstory myself, a little bit of myself. I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, I'm an author. I tend to write mostly about music. That seems to be the world I kind of traffic in. My first two books were Bluegrass in Baltimore, The Hard Drive and Sound of Its Legacy, which looked at the history of bluegrass in Baltimore, its kind of influence and larger kind of legacy. And my second book was Leftover Salmon, 30 Years of Festival, which looked at the progressive bluegrass band Leftover Salmon. They were coming up on their 30th anniversary, and they were super influential and kind of helped start, for lack of a better word, and that's a whole other podcast, or the idea of jam grass. But so how did I go from that to baseball? Well, as I was wrapping up the Salmon, I kind of had gone on tour with them. We would open each night. I'd open each night with a reading from the book and talk a little bit. We were getting to the end of that tour. We were in Nashville, and my wife came out for part of it. And when we were done, we were just going to take a kind of road trip, and we went up through Kentucky, and we ended up in Louisville. And we were just doing the touristy thing, and we were at the Slugger Museum. And I knew a little bit about Pete Browning just as a baseball fan. I kind of knew the name and knew he was out there, but beyond that, I wasn't super familiar. And my wife always has this really good antenna for stories. She'll always be like, "Oh, that sounds like a great story. You should write about that, or maybe you should think about talking about that." So we're on the tour, and they're talking about Pete and his quirks and what he did, and this really interesting guy. And she kind of was like, "This guy's pretty interesting. Like, you may want to think about this guy." And I remember that night we were at dinner, and we were just having a couple of beers and kind of looking up on our phone just what we could find, just Googling Pete Browning, and oh, look at this story, and look at this kind of crazy story here. And I thought, wow, this guy's really interesting. And the question people always ask is, well, how do you go from bluegrass and leftover salmon to baseball? Well, one, I love all of that, and I just like to tell stories. But to me, the connection there are these overlooked, under-recognized, but highly influential figures. And as I was kind of looking up the stuff on Pete, I was like, man, he sort of seems to be what I like to talk about. Like, he's this super influential guy. I mean, he's the Louisville Slugger, and we can talk about that in a little bit, but he's kind of overlooked and under-recognized, and he comes to the 19th century. So I said, well, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and just research and see if maybe there's a reason that we don't talk about him anymore. Like maybe his story is only this big, and that's it. So I took the rest of the summer, and I kind of started researching. And for part of my research, what I thought I wanted to do was literally go through and do all of his games. Like, obviously the stats are there, but it's 19th century. And I thought, well, let me just kind of go through. So I literally went through and like hand kept every game. I would look at like box scores and stories from like three different sources. I would look at the home team. I would look at whatever the home team would have been in the game, but I'd look at a Louisville box score, whoever they were playing. And then if I could find like a national, like a New York or a Philly paper or something that maybe had a little bit different. And I went through every one of his games that way. So I kind of had his whole career, and I kind of started getting stories and could start seeing some of these legends kind of taking shape. Like, I can see this now. And at the end of the summer, I thought, there is something here. I really want to tell this story. So I just kind of started diving in from there. And obviously, since it's a 19th century ball player, there really wasn't a lot of people to talk to as far as like, first person accounts. Most of those people, all those people had really passed on. So it was a lot of research. It was a lot of fun. One of the things I love doing is that research and really digging in. So, while yes, it was tedious to kind of go through and read papers and search and do all that, it was also fun because there's that fun of the discovery of like, well, look at this story. And, one of the neat things that I kind of started discovering is with Pete, there's this like legend of Pete. We know certain things, and I'm sure we'll talk about a bunch of that tonight. But, there's the legend, and then there's the truth. And I was really interested in like, where do they meet and where does it come together? We know some of the legend, but what's even the truth behind that legend? It was interesting to see some of these legendary stories that we maybe had heard. And then as I read through, like finding the truth and seeing how that story evolved and where it came from. And, it's interesting because for all 19th century baseball and, all that kind of really pre-modern era, like that's what we're doing. We don't have anything to watch. We don't have a lot of those like great first person accounts. We've got to go dig through these papers and letters and stuff. And there was some letters and some things like that he found that would give you some interesting kind of stories. So that's kind of really where it started from. And I spent the next couple of years just, putting this story together, and, stuff would slowly fit. You'd have a bit of a story here, and you'd have this one thing you kind of knew, but you couldn't get it, completely solidified. And then you'd find something later on and you could get it. So it was kind of a long process of that, but it was a couple year process. I would say I put, that first time I went to the Slugger factory would have been in July of 2019. And the book came out in September of 24. So it's about 5 years. All of 24 was pretty much mostly just kind of that like pre-publicity, finalized stuff. So the book was probably finished in September of 23, and then it was just, some final editing and kind of getting ready for publication and stuff like that. But it was about a 5 year process, and it's about, I guess, what it normally takes me for books and stuff. So it's fun.
Okay. Oh man. So I guess I'll bring up your slideshow and stuff. I mean, it's very interesting. It took you that long, to, I guess, do a lot of digging and research and in there. So where did you find, before I bring up your slides, like where was the research that you were digging up from? Like, was it from the Sabre website? Was it from like stuff around the Louisville area?
So I cast a pretty wide net. I mean, obviously the biggest kind of sources were newspapers, and one thing we're lucky to have in this day and age is so many papers have been digitized that we have access to them. So it wasn't just one paper. There's papers from all across the country, and it was reading different stories, or even reading different variations of the same story, or even reading, in some cases, they would literally have the same story, but in certain cities, they would have a little bit more added to it or something like that. So newspapers were obviously one of the biggest kind of drivers of it, because that was as close as you're going to get to any kind of first-person accounting there. I spent some time up at the Hall of Fame in the research center up there. There was a sports writer in Louisville. His name was H. Tarvin. He wasn't present with Pete Browning. He was kind of the generation after that, but his father was. And so he had a lot of that he kind of related back to. And he was also very tied into the scene. And he wrote these columns that kind of talked about that. So while he wasn't there, he had pretty good knowledge of people he had met and knew from that era. And he knew some of the players from that era. And so he had some really good kind of columns, and not all of them had been published, but I went there, and that was a great resource. It was a huge, just, all of his writings or stuff like that. One of Pete's teammates, Guy Hecker, had written a book. It was mostly about the art of pitching, but there were some kind of gems in there. Tony Mullane, who was a teammate of Pete's for a couple seasons as well. He had some letters that mentioned stuff. So it was kind of a little bit here, a little bit there. Obviously newspapers were the bulk of it, because that was helping me kind of put things in order and setting up a timeline and getting that all together.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll bring up your slides, and then I'll just let you roll from here. You talk, and then, I'll probably jump in with some questions.
Sure. Well, so kind of like I said, one of the things that I really was interested in doing with this was kind of finding that where the truth and the like the fiction is with Pete, where the legend and the the reality is. So that kind of was one of my main goals with these. So just a little background on Pete. This isn't obviously Pete Browning. This is my daughter in the Orioles game last year. But whenever we do slides, I always think that, what's more baseball than this? And there's a bigger story than that, but we can move on to Pete right now. But this is my daughter in a baseball game. All right, so let's get back to Pete here. So a little bit about Pete, so that we're kind of all on the same page of where he is. Pete was born in Louisville in 1861. He discovers baseball as a young man in the city. He's kind of coming of age, just kind of baseball is also like evolving itself. So he's in a very interesting era. And that was an interesting aspect of the book as well, was kind of seeing his evolution with the evolution of the game at this kind of the same time. He starts playing very early on in the west end of town. He had a team that he played with. They kind of started as a local team. They'd eventually evolve into a semi-pro team. They would eventually evolve into one of the elite semi-pro league teams in the country. And that team would eventually almost just kind of become the professional team when Louisville goes into Major League Baseball with the American Association in 1882. But Pete himself, he starts playing as a young man, was immediately one of the better players in the team, leads the team often in hitting, is one of their better fielders at the time, which is interesting given what his reputation becomes later on, and we can kind of talk about that a little bit. But one of the things that we should know about Pete is early on in his life, he developed a health condition, which kind of becomes a really important part of his life, and to me helps explain a lot of the stories it was. So he develops this issue, this health issue called mastoiditis, and basically it's an infection of your inner ear. Nowadays, it's not a big deal. It's treatable with antibiotics and stuff. But in Pete's age, there was no antibiotics there, so it was a pretty deadly infection at the time that could happen. Pete lived through it. It's not quite clear when he got it, but it most likely happened when he was very young, 2 or 3. And from that, a lot of the things that we know about Pete, quirks that we know about Pete, we can kind of explain. So Pete's personality, he's kind of regarded as this very loud, boisterous person. And he was, and I think you have to have some of that. But what we also find is Pete had kind of lost most of his hearing by the time that he was a teenager or so. And so I think with that, it starts helping develop a lot of these personality quirks that we kind of can talk about. The loudness obviously is to overcompensate for the fact that he couldn't hear when he was talking to other people, and the idea of talking about yourself. I mean, I always think you're unsure what somebody else is talking about, you can't hear them. The easy solution is to turn it kind of back on yourself and kind of just start talking about yourself. The other interesting thing about this is Pete's name. It's not even Pete, it's Louis Rogers Browning. But he used to refer to everybody as Pete, and the nickname kind of got thrown back on him. And so that kind of becomes his nickname. The health condition is going to give him kind of severe headaches, vertigo, pain and swelling in the eyes. He often was referred to as having kind of a very, very quirky look because his ears sometimes pushed forward. It had some swelling, so that was likely from that. So a lot of who he was can be derived kind of from this condition here. Kind of one of the other kind of overriding kind of things that we can kind of come to know about Pete is that he was known as, a champion consumer of bourbon in an age of hard drinking. He kind of starts drinking as a young man. There's a number of different stories given to it. As with most things with Pete, they all kind of revolve around baseball. For Pete, the stories kind of are twofold. One, he was in a game and it was claimed that every time you got to third base, they would they had a beer there, or they had a keg there or something. And every time you got to third, you were entitled to a glass of beer. And Pete said, I'm going to get to third as many times as I can so I can get as many glasses of beer. The other story, which maybe even be a little more plausible, is Pete early on in his career was a pitcher. And as a young man, 15-year-old or so, he was playing in a game against some older men and was dominating them from the mound. The other team in between innings started feeding him drinks or beers in hopes that it would kind of maybe ruin his game. Whatever it was, or however he kind of came into the drinking, he discovered that it definitely helped him out. I think it gave him some of that liquid courage, which he definitely needed as somebody who, despite this outgoing personality, was regarded as generally being pretty shy, and probably a lot because he couldn't hear. It also, kind of helped with some of his head issues. It probably kind of maybe like took a little bit of the pain. So I think that Pete kind of discovered that, it definitely was the whiskey that eased the pain there for him. Regardless, though, Pete is going to go on and have a pretty kind of amazing career regardless of that. He plays the Louisville Eclipse, which you guys can see from the screen here. This is Pete. He is in kind of the center of the screen there. This is Pete as either an old 15-year-old or a young 16-year-old, depending on what year this picture was taken here. This was the Louisville Eclipse team. And again, they were one of the best semi-pro teams in the country. They would kind of play other teams from around the country, and they were, extremely highly regarded. That team in 1882 would evolve into a major league team that would then play in the American Association. So, we kind of have the base. That's who Pete is. Pete's going to make his debut in 1882. He has an amazing rookie year. He's going to win a batting title. He's going to lead the American Association in just about every, statistical offense category. And he's going to go on to win 3 more batting titles. Over the next 10 years, he's going to finish in the top 3 9 times over that. He'll win 3 batting titles in 2 different leagues, which just doesn't happen. He finishes in the top 3 another 3 times. So he has a pretty amazing kind of run there, despite some of these health issues that we're kind of talking about here. But with all that, that's kind of who Pete is. So then we got to kind of talk a little bit about kind of the legend of Pete here a little bit. So I think to kind of get to that, we talked a little bit about Pete's personality. Excuse me. And we said that, Pete was this, kind of very loud, kind of boisterous person. and known to kind of be this kind of loud, exuberant drunk. And I think it's fair to say that those were all kind of issues that he had and he dealt with. But again, we talked about this health issue he had, this hearing that he had, and a lot of that is going to be tied back to this mastoiditis. And it's not just kind of the surface things, the hearing and the things like the drinking to ease the pain there. And Pete was very much kind of allowed, kind of would talk about his drinking and how much it did for it. He used to talk about, when he came up to the plate, he would envision, like all the liquid tarnish or the tonsil varnish he was going to drink, when he got a hit, and that would make him get a hit there. So he was kind of reveled in it for a while there. But this impact on him and his game is what kind of becomes interesting. And then there's kind of a couple other legends there. So the impact on Pete's game itself. So Pete was regarded as a horrendous fielder. And that's not really true. The stats and the numbers don't quite bear itself out to that. He wasn't great at times, but a lot of it became kind of brought on because of himself. Early on in Pete's career, he was playing second and short. And again, I am not a defensive genius when it comes to baseball, but I'm pretty sure you don't put your worst fielders at those positions. But the problem was, because he was struggling to hear, he got ran over a number of times in the base pass by oncoming runners. So he took the standing on one foot with his leg kind of pointing out with his knee up in hopes that it would deter runners from running into him. Well, again, I am not a defensive wizard. I am not a baseball coach, but I'm pretty sure standing on one leg in the field is not the best positioning to be to play defense. He also started stepping further and further and further back on the infield, which again doesn't seem to really lend itself to playing good baseball. So eventually he's moved into the outfield. When he gets into the outfield, he kind of continues a number of these kind of same attributes. He's standing on one foot. And then he seems that he's giving up on fly balls. Well, part of it is he can't hear his teammates who may or may not be calling off for a fly ball, and Pete just determines it was easier not to move. The other side of that also is that he sometimes would stand if there was a shadow that was being cast, there were some trees, he would stand in the shadow because he kind of talked about how the heat would just exacerbate all these symptoms in his head. And his manager or other players tell him, hey, Pete, you got to move here, or you got to come over here, to help out. And he would say, look, that's fine. I can move over there. But, if my head hurts and I can't swing at the plate, like, what good am I? Like, anybody can stand out in the outfield and catch a ball, but you really need me at the plate right now. So I'm going to stand back here in the shade, and I'm going to feel pretty good. So I think some of the stuff that happens on the field, we talk about this horrible fielding of his and how bad a fielder he was. It's not really entirely true. He kind of brought that on himself. Even later in his career, he was kind of ridiculed for stopping grounders with his feet in the outfield. And again, that just sounds like this ridiculous kind of quirk that somebody may do. But if we think about it, if you have vertigo, the simple act of bending over is likely to cause that vertigo, and you're going to get dizzy and fall over. So when we see that, it kind of puts some of his playing in perspective and maybe helps us understand that a little bit more. It doesn't seem that his hearing necessarily impacted his hitting. In fact, maybe it helped him concentrate there. Pete actually, despite some of the outward demeanor and thoughts that he was, Pete actually worked really hard at his hitting. He was known early on to kind of, get up and go out there by himself and just sit there and, take hit after hit. And again, he's just throwing off himself and hitting him. So he did work hard. So I think it's not fair to say that he just wasn't a good fielder when you take in the fact that he did work hard at his hitting and understood that. And while he made comments about, I don't care about the fielding, I think that was more of a defense mechanism, which we often see with Pete. So the other thing we often see kind of with Pete, with some of his kind of legacy, is we talk about these weird quirks that he had. He was known how he cared for his eyes, or as he called them, his lamps. And he believed that you had to have bright lamps so you can see the ball. They've got to be good. They've got to be really well. And again, on one thing, let's just pause for a moment and think about this. He's recognizing how important his eyes are to the art of hitting. Players now are literally doing kind of exercise and skills, right, where they do stuff so they can watch the ball and track it. So Pete, on some level, is recognizing that now. He's not quite doing it the same way. And I also think there's also another level built into this. But he was known to do some pretty kind of what would seem bizarre things. When it rained, he would kind of walk out with his head and let the rain wash his eyes out. He would pour buttermilk into his eyes. He was kind of known when he smoked cigarettes to blow the smoke out and then hope that it went back into his eyes. He often said when he rode a train, he would hang his head out the window in hopes that he would catch ash or cinder in his eyes. I don't think there seems to be any proof that ever happened, because he probably wouldn't have had much of a career after that. And again, all those things can seem utterly ridiculous and just seemed like another case of bizarre Pete doing something. But let's think again about Pete's health condition, his mastoiditis. Part of the effects of it was in his eyes. He had swelling, he had pain, they probably often hurt. So the idea of pouring buttermilk in there, it seems soothing, right? That soothing buttermilk probably feels good. Now, I did talk with an optometrist, and he said that pouring the buttermilk into his eyes is probably more dangerous than drinking it because of the bacteria in it, and drinking it would have been more beneficial for his eyes because of all the nutrients in there. But I don't think Pete had a medical degree. So again, here's a man with limited education in an era of questionable medical practices who is trying to self-medicate some of this, And again, some of them may be silly, but at the same time, for him, he's probably trying to justify making my eyes feel better, and I'm trying to do this. And I'm not saying he doesn't have some quirks, but when we look at that, his health condition, and then look at these kind of silly quirks that we had, it starts kind of maybe we understand it a little bit better or a little bit more and go, that makes sense. So then the two biggest myths with Pete is his drinking and then the Louisville Slugger. So we'll talk about drinking first. So yes, Pete was a legendary drinker, right? In an age of hard drinking in baseball. But interestingly enough, some of the stories that are attributed to him aren't entirely true. Now, that doesn't mean that Pete wasn't drinking, didn't show up to games regularly drunk. Doesn't mean that we can wonder what if, right? I mean, what if Pete had been a little more sober at times? I mean, he was this good here. What if he, showed up to games just sober a few times? Maybe he was here. But some of the famous quotes that are attributed to him, we need to look at because it takes a little bit different context here. So the most famous quote that we attribute to Pete is the quote where he says, "I can't hit until I hit the bottle." And I always think it sounds like this funny, this fun-loving drunk who just says, "Hold on here, I gotta have a drink before I walk up to the plate so I can hit the ball out of here." And I think we can find some humor in that, and it maybe makes Pete kind of be a bit lovable here. Just this guy's got to go have his drink and then he's gonna go hit. But that's not what he said. What happened was in 1888, he was in the midst of a slump, and he had signed a temperance pledge at the beginning of the year saying he wasn't going to drink, as he often did. And he was in a huge slump at the time, the worst slump he'd been into kind of up to that point in his career. And he was talking with a friend, and he said, I think I'm going to have to start drinking again so that I can hit the ball. And I know that change seems slight, but when you think about it, he's equating his skill of hitting a baseball with drinking. And I think that's kind of becomes a bit sad. And in an era when we didn't have a good understanding of alcoholism or addiction or those types of things that Pete was likely suffering with, here's Pete, who is this unbelievably talented ball player who thinks I need to drink and get drunk to hit because right now I'm not hitting and that's the only thing I've taken out of the equation. And I think that changes our perception of him a little bit. The other story is there's a kind of a famous story of in 1889, Pete was on a road trip. And he was in Kansas City, and after the game, he had gathered all his fishing stuff because it had been raining, and out front of the hotel, the gutters had kind of filled with water. He was going to sit out front and cast a line and smoke a cigar and catch his dinner there. And that sounds funny, right? It's just drunk Pete sitting out front fishing in the gutters. But again, that's not what happened. What had happened was Pete was going to go fishing, but he passed out on the sidewalk out in front of the hotel, and they had to carry him back in. And again, that speaks more to the addiction and alcoholism that we've got to kind of understand with Pete. Here's this guy who's battling health issues and alcoholism and addiction and all these types of things, and he's still out here producing. I think that changes. Pete's this really tragic figure on some level. He's this guy who's battling these health issues. He's, kind of limited education. And again, a lot of players of this era would have been battling alcoholism, and it's a struggle for him. And then again, despite this loud nature, he's kind of also a shy individual on some level. And again, there's always the question of, well, what happens if he would have went elsewhere? And again, Pete had opportunities to go play in the National League and play elsewhere. And I think he was very happy to be at home. I think the other thing to think about that, and when we start thinking about Pete's legacy, and we can talk about that a little differently, is I don't think Pete and necessarily all players viewed the National League as where they wanted to go. The National League was only a handful of years old at this time, and they were playing in a league that was a professional league just as well as that. So I don't think some of them viewed that they had to go there. He was producing and recognized as one of the better players. So I don't think there was that like he had to go there, and he was very happy to be at home. So I guess we'll get back to what the first thing we kind of talked about here is the Louisville Slugger. We'll kind of get back to maybe the most famous myth of them all. And the most famous myth of them all is Pete and his connection to Hillerk & Bradsby, the company that makes the Louisville Slugger kind of brand bats. So the legend or the myth is this. In 1884, Pete was in the midst of a slump. He breaks his bat, and Bud Hillerick, who is the son of J.F. Hillerick, who owns, at the time, was just Hillerick Woodworking Company, approaches him and says, we can go back to, my dad's shop and I can make you a bat. The two of them go back to the shop and they have to go at the cover of darkness at night because JF was opposed to baseball because it was associated with gambling and drinking at the time. They go back and under the cover of night, Bud's over there on the lathe working the bat and Pete's over there giving him direction. And Pete picks up the bat every now and then. He tests it out and then Bud does a little more work. And finally, he has the perfect bat in his hand. He goes out the next day and he goes 4 for 4. And the legend or the myth of the Louisville Slugger is born because Pete had a lot of nicknames in his career, and one of them was the Louisville Slugger, though it's a nickname that is used almost the least out of all of his other nicknames. He was more often known as the Gladiator and the Old War Horse and Old Pete, but it is one of his nicknames. But that's the legend. Well, there's a lot of question about that legend and myth because there's no direct evidence in 1884 that it happened. And there's some question or debate. Did this really happen? Did Pete actually have a bat turned by somebody at the Hiller Company that would lead to this? So my answer becomes yes. And here is why, and I'll give you my, and there's all kinds of arguments. Here's my argument on why yes. So one, I don't think there would have been any direct evidence at the time. I don't know if a 17-year-old Bud who was going against the wishes of his father would have been happy to broadcast around town what he was doing. Pete himself was kind of notorious for always really taking care of his bats and getting bats made wherever he could. So in his mind, he had just had a bat made from someone. Now, it seems he doesn't like it because there seems to be proof and kind of references throughout the rest of the 1880s and into the 1890s of Pete getting bats made by a firm in Louisville. Now, we can sit here and say maybe it was another woodworking company, but I think it's a hard kind of to go, well, there's multiple woodworking companies in Louisville. He's getting a bat from there. That woodworking company goes away, and this other one then kind of comes up, and then all of a sudden has a connection to Pete. So I think it's fair to say that this company here is where he's getting his bat from. And he often would talk about getting bats turned there and getting stuff made there. When he was in Pittsburgh in 1891, there's an article that talks about him getting a collection of bats that had been mailed from home, and he was so excited because they were all custom made. Now, at the same time, Pete is also getting these bats and passing them out to teammates, letting teammates use them. So on some level, spreading the word of this company that seems to be pretty good at doing this. By 1894, Hiller Company is starting to make bats kind of as their main thing. They weren't doing that before. They made butter churns and chair legs and stair rolls, so they weren't a bat company on some level, which is another reason I don't know if there would have been a lot of talk of Pete or Bud saying they were doing it, because it was just Bud who had kind of either approached Pete. Pete may have known Bud, which probably seems more likely. Bud played some baseball in the area, so it seems more likely that Pete on some level knew him. It's also likely that Bud had been making bats and other people in Louisville had them, but Pete probably seems likely to be the first kind of professional player and then had the first bat turned to kind of custom specifications. The kind of how the story kind of starts evolving. There's some more articles in 1903. There's a brief mention of Pete and this company in Louisville where he got his bats turned. The first real time we see the legend start to take shape is in 1909. There's an article by a Boston sports writer named Bill Spargo, and he lays out that legend as I just told you. The only difference there is he doesn't have Pete listed in there. Pete seems to be being reattached to the story over the next decade or so. Now, Pete had also died in 1905, so these stories kind of start coming out after him. But there starts coming some stories. There's some stories of that the bat wasn't made, that Pete was in a slump and Bud just put a circle on the bat for home runs. But again, there's a connection there. Interestingly enough, in JF, the father's obituary, he actually his obituary makes claim that he made the bat for Pete, which is interesting that the legend always was he was against it. Throughout the 1920s, there's a number of articles kind of about the history of Hiller and Bradsby at this time, and how Pete had got that first bat turned there, and he was the first player to have a custom-made bat. So it seems to kind of like solidify in there. What does happen then is we see some challenges to that, and not even necessarily directly. Artie Latham, who was an ex-teammate of Pete's, seems the two of them had a bit of a contentious relationship when they were in Cincinnati, starts saying that he actually had the first bat made from there. Seems highly unlikely that Bud would have turned a bat for somebody from Cincinnati at the time, who was also not a very popular player. And it also seems later on he kind of clears up that, yes, like that was just a bit of a joke that kind of Arlie was doing there. So for me, Pete had a bat turned on some level by Hiller Company. maybe it's not the myth of him going back under the cover of darkness. He may have just had it back there. He may have really liked it, and then he helped popularize that. Because interestingly enough, one of the other questions in 1884 is you can't find any of that, like there's a slump and then this 4-for-4 game. There's never that. So the one time he was in a really big slump and he comes out of it is when he has surgery. But I think it's fair to say that he had, a bat made there. They eventually kind of start producing bats. His nickname is Louisville Slugger, and they're going to apply that nickname onto there as kind of a way to kind of respect that. One last story, and then if you have some questions here, one last story is, interestingly enough, the first player to have their name on a bat is going to be Honus Wagner. Honus Wagner actually played in Louisville, and Pete knew him. Pete was known to keep all of his bats after he was done playing, and he had them all in the basement of his house. And Honus Wagner came over one time and really was kind of struck on this one bat. And Pete gifted it to him. So it's not out of the realm of possibility, too, that Honus Wagner first learned about the beauty of, kind of what would become the Louisville Slugger brand through Pete when he kind of went over to his house and saw these bats and had a chance to kind of play with them there.
Yeah. I think Wagner was the first professional player to be to sponsor or be sponsored by Louisville's. I think also.
Yep.
But with the bats, what's kind of interesting too is what companies back then were making bats for Pete to have one, because I think if I remember right, players would grab anything like a stick or table legs or whatever at that time for something. They weren't uniform like how they are now. So I think Pete's was the driving force of having one to specifications. I would say.
I think that's another aspect kind of missing about Pete is Pete actually put a lot of thought into his bats. It's interesting for somebody who's kind of regarded as this kind of drunk, semi-educated man, how much thought he actually put into baseball, and some of the things he did, while maybe not entirely right, has a bit of a grain of truth or a ring of truth in there. He put a lot of thought into bats. Some players, like you said, they would just use whatever they could find, next stick on the pile. If it broke, they would nail it back together. Pete didn't. He had different bats, and an interesting thing with Pete, to kind of get to the superstitious side of him, he believed all bats had a predetermined number of hits, which sounds quirky, but if you think about that, isn't that a great way to take all the stress off of yourself? When you don't get a hit after a couple times, it's not your fault. It's the bat's fault. And you just put it to the side and grab the next bat up. Oh, and I'm good to go. And he did. And he used different size bats. He believed that I'm going to use longer bats or shorter bats or lighter bats or heavier bats. The bat that he had made and the one that he used the most was massive. It was 48 ounces. And somebody put that in good kind of perspective for me. They said Aaron Judge swings like a 33-ounce bat. And when he's in the on-deck circle, the warm-up donut that he puts on there is 15 ounces. So he's warming up with a 48-ounce bat there. And that's what Pete swung every day. It's kind of interesting to think about how big that is, and Aaron Judge, this monster of a guy,
Yeah. And I know, reading your book, it was Pete, when Pete would go to games or I guess other teams were playing it there, he would go look at their bats and do a trade or try to buy their bat or whatever, because he liked that bat. He felt like that bat was special and he wanted that in his collection.
Yeah. And he kind of always proudly says he never stole a bat. He always would trade for it or get it. And, there were still bats that he kind of coveted his whole career, never gotten. For whatever reason, he would pick it up and like the feel or heft of it. So I also don't think he was exclusively getting bats made from Hillard Company. I think he was probably getting a lot there. Eventually, once they especially start making them kind of to order for him, that would lend the belief that then he's going there more and more. And at that same time, we also see the development of baseball equipment through the 1880s and into the 1890s, where baseball equipment is just getting better and better and better. So we start seeing that development and more care into it.
Yeah. And then, another thing with his bats, like you mentioned in your book, if you probably want to go more into it, what he would do in the off season to the bats to prepare for the next season.
Yeah. So like with everything, his eye care, he had bat care. And, he really did put thought into this, but he believed that he had to take care of his bats in the off season. He would do things like rub them down with bone and stuff like that. And he believed he was hardening them up. He rubbed them down with tobacco juice, which seems to kind of have influenced some other players, and that was going to harden up when it dried. He soaked them in water in hopes that they would get heavier. And it's hard to imagine somebody who's swinging a 48-ounce bat who wants it heavier. But he believed all of that. He wanted them heavier, and he kind of would joke because he didn't worry about other players necessarily taking his bats, because he was like, they can take them, but they're not going to be able to swing them. But he was fine with other players using his bats if they could go use them. He had one bat that was taken at the end of the year that I think really bothered him. He used it all season in 1890 in the Players League. And at the end of the year, it kind of disappeared. Somebody picked up and grabbed it and kind of lost that. And I think historically a sad side of this is there's no real good record of what happened to all of Pete's bats. They were in his house. He lived with his mom and his sister his whole life. They were in the basement. And while there's a few of them that seem to kind of be out there, there's just, there's no record of where they are. Most likely they were given away or thrown away. And, all the history of these bats would have been kind of amazing to see and have it. They just kind of seem to be gone. That, whatever happened, his mom cleared them out. And, it's like when your mom goes and clears out your baseball cards and you go back later on, you're like, what did you do? It's kind of the same idea.
I believe you also mentioned it in the book too, is like he labeled each bat and what that bat did in those games. Like he knew the history of all the bats.
Yep. Yeah, when a bat ran out of its predetermined number of hits, he would put a little tag on there with maybe like a special thing that it had done. Some of them he actually turned into railings for his stairs. Some of them he kind of had hanging around the walls in his basement, but most of them were just kind of lined up there. And it was thought that he had hundreds of bats that were kind of down there. I mean, that would have been an amazing thing to see, and look at all that history and those different types of bats, and read the different game tags on them and stuff like that.
It's just crazy the mindset of him, like with his bats. And then because it's like he took more care of like the bats than probably like his uniform or anything else, because what do they have, like one, maybe two uniforms all season?
Yeah.
Or even if a full uniform.
And he was known to write his batting average on his cuffs to make sure that he was getting his batting average correctly recorded there. So there's a funny story where he claims one year that he had done better in the batting race than he was given credit for, but they had done his wash and his batting averages had been washed off his sleeve, and so now nobody's going to really know what he had hit. But he always would write down what he had done on his sleeves, because he's going to keep track himself.
All right, so we're gonna move on from the bats, and then so what is this right here with this slide?
Well, this was just kind of talking about.
Where are we going next?
This is just kind of more talking about some of this is some of the slides that I hadn't quite pushed through. This is just again, Pete kind of talking about when he was in the field, and as I was saying, he often suffered from headaches in the field, and the sun kind of impacting that. And this was kind of his quote that he kind of would tell people about, like, look, I can, go out there, but if I'm not doing well, who's going to go out there? Like, you need me to hit. Anybody can go shag a fly ball up there. And it's interesting too, because I think a lot of how Pete spoke, and it's great. He was a very quotable person. He was known to be very kind of boisterous and kind of talk. So there's a lot of great quotes for him. Is that he definitely was. I think his personality isn't, or his kind of outward demeanor isn't always necessarily reflective of who he truly was, because he seemed to be aware of kind of the persona that he put out there at times. And some of the things he said, whether he said it intentionally, but didn't bother to correct it, or he said it and didn't worry about how it was going to be taken. And I think that's kind of an interesting side of Pete that gets lost. It's like, I think sometimes we look at him as this very simple man, but I think there's a lot of complexities to him. Again, he still has a limited education, and, one of the myths is still obviously how he was illiterate. It doesn't seem that's entirely true. It seems that he was, reading on some level. There's stories of him keeping every article that had his name in there, but there's also enough stories too about that he didn't do it very well. But I think it's easy to just kind of look at the surface level of Pete, and that was kind of what I liked kind of doing going into this, was kind of finding all those different layers of Pete, finding those different levels, and going, this is the man here. And, kind of that's the interesting thing about 19th century baseball, right? Is we don't have YouTube videos. We can go watch a player like we can some players. What the access of stuff we do have. So we have to kind of build these characters, or figure out who they are by getting all these other sources and putting them all together and then kind of looking at them there. And I think it's it's neat. It's also the same thing with baseball at the time. 19th century baseball is figuring out who it is. And if we try and think about 19th century baseball like we do modern baseball, it's not going to work because the game was slightly different. You know what I mean? And we got to kind of compare what they're doing to what they were doing then. You know, it's not fair to say, oh, you know, he had less than 50 career home runs. Well, that's true, but when he retired, like, you know, he might have been in the top 4 for home runs. You know, he was finished second when he was 9 home runs. We've got to kind of understand the differences in the game and the play style and stuff like that.
Okay.
Let's see what other one I meant. This is just an interesting picture. This is Pete in the 1889 season here. That's Pete in the back row center. They're kind of wearing the sweater there.
Yeah. Because this is their worst season, correct? The 1889 season.
Yeah, it's one of the worst seasons ever. First team to lose 100 games. They still hold the record for the longest losing streak. And it was just a disaster on so many levels. In addition, and I'm sorry, this picture is actually from 1888, but the 1889 season is still one of their worst seasons. But it was a disaster on so many levels. The owner was kind of running out of money and started just finding the players to kind of make payroll, and he would find them for anything he could. It got so bad the players actually had a strike, and literally, like, the players didn't play. It's the first players' strike ever. But they decided they were not going to play for him, and they had to just get some local players to fill out and play for the game. Eventually, the American Association steps in, and the team is kind of taken away from the owner there, and they kind of get things straightened out. But it was just an utter disaster. I mean, when you look at some of the stats of what they didn't do, like, you know, they only won back-to-back games like once or twice, and, you know, they had a 26-game losing streak and a 13-game losing streak and a 10-game losing streak. Like, it's pretty mind-boggling how bad they actually were. And then an interesting kind of fun side of that is Guy Hecker, who was on that team on the 1889 that loses 100 games, goes to Pittsburgh the next year, which also loses 100 games. So I don't know how many players can say they played on back-to-back 100-loss teams that were actually two different clubs there.
I know that we're talking about Pete, but Guy Hecker, well, he's the only one with a batting title and a what's for the pitching at that time? What was it?
Well, I mean, basically, pitching triple crown. He would have he led the league in wins, and yeah. I mean, I think when people talk about like Shohei Ohtani, they forget that Guy Hecker was doing that, you know, back in the day. I mean, he went 52 and 21 year. That's a pretty solid pitching year right there.
Yeah.
And the year he won that batting title, he actually won it over Pete by what might figure out to like about one hit when it was all said and done. And he had quite a few less at bats than Pete did. But again, that's another interesting thing with Pete and his kind of legacies. He has these 3 batting titles in 2 different leagues. But he finishes second 3 other times. One time he hits 407, finishes second. One time he loses out to Guy Hecker, a pitcher, by basically a hit. And then in 1891, his first year in the National League, he was on a tear at the end of the year. And he gets his wrist broken in September. And so we don't know what happens, but he finished in 3rd that year. And, you know, it's that other possibility that he could have won a batting title that year. And I think that's a mind-boggling thing to think about, that we would be talking about somebody who won 4 titles in 3 different leagues, because that's an impossibility now, right? There's not 3 professional leagues out there. So it's something that would never, ever happen again. I think that changes his perspective a little bit of his Hall of Fame legacy, which is another whole interesting discussion.
Yeah, and also like with reading and stuff, it's like you mentioned, like there was a few times that if he wasn't an alcoholic, like I think like his batting, like he would have beat out Camp Anson in batting titles, you know, that season for the batting title or whatever. So I mean, you got this player like up there with a Hall of Famer, you know. So it just shows you how well Pete was playing at the time, you know, as you know, being drunk most of the games.
Well,
you know,
and I think that's the thing too, is it's not fair to say that his drinking didn't impact this game, because it obviously, I'm sure it did, but he was still producing at such a high level. And the tough thing with Pete is, you know, so for all this, we talk about this legacy and his players, like he's not in the Hall of Fame, and he's never had one vote cast for him for that. Now, there's a number of reasons, you know, for that. I mean, one of them is he played in the American Association, and by the time the Hall of Fame came around, the American Association was long forgotten, and baseball scholarship isn't, you know, or wasn't then what it is now. And so people didn't look at the American Association, didn't think about that. It's taken a long time for us to kind of go back and reevaluate that. And I still think there's a little bit of a bias or negativity towards the American Association that, look, people above my pay grade can tell me whether I'm right or wrong in this, but like, I don't think that's entirely true because, the National League was 6 years old at the time the American Association came in. I just don't think that people viewed it that drastically different. And it seems that when players moved back and forth from league to league, which they often did, they kind of finished the same general area with the batting or pitching, whatever. If they hit 320 in the American Association, they hit almost 320 in the National League. So it doesn't seem that the talent level was drastically different there.
Yeah.
And in 1890, there's a third league called the Players League, which is a whole other interesting story. But basically, all the best players had kind of wanted to form their own league for different reasons, and it wasn't just solely money. They were hoping to have some levels of ownership, and it's a really interesting kind of labor dispute. But it's pretty much all the best players, and the player who wins the batting title in that league is Pete. So in the one time when you can say almost all the best players from the National League and the American Association are together, Pete wins that batting title and wins it by far. So I think it's interesting that when you do bring those players together, you've seen it. And if I remember correctly, I think the top two players were both ex-American Association guys. So it wasn't even like it was all National League guys. And I think the top pitcher was a guy who'd just been in the American Association the year before. So, we unfairly look at the American Association now, and what it was. And I think that's really held against Pete.
Yeah, because all these leagues, they were playing against each other, so it wasn't like the National League wasn't just playing against National League, the American Association wasn't just playing against them. They were playing each other during the year. So it's like, to me, I feel like you shouldn't, or the Hall of Fame shouldn't exclude that part of the history out. They should include that in there with the players that developed, probably different things, and brought different rules and, different, like, whatever else to the game. So, I mean, it's part of the baseball history.
Yeah, and I mean, it's tough because I just think that we're so far removed from that now that it's going to be tough to go back and, like, really accurately do that, right? I mean, because now those 19th century players are lumped in with everybody from 1980 and before. I mean, if a Hall of Fame voter is going to vote on somebody, who are they going to vote on? Somebody from 1975 who they saw as a child, or somebody from 1884 who they read about, in a newspaper? And it's hard to make those connections there. Like, I think it's going to be a struggle. And Pete's not the only player from that era who deserves consideration, right? Whether you think Pete should be in or not, like, Pete's not the only player who deserves at least consideration. Maybe the solution is we just take one more swipe at the 19th century and say, let's get them all right. Let's just get all the last 19th century players and close the book on the 19th century. We can move on. Because, there's a number of players who just have been overlooked. And, like I said, baseball scholarship, has improved so much. It wasn't that when the Hall of Fame started. You're relying on guys who might have been still alive or guys who were still being talked about or whatever. But, by that time, these players who retired have been retired, 40, 50 years before. That's a couple generations before. Not many people had seen them directly play.
Yeah. Very true. All right. So let's keep trucking along here, and so I'll let you keep going where you want to go on this.
Well, I mean, this is just kind of just the wrap up. This is really just kind of what we were just talking about here.
Okay.
I mean, this is just kind of about what we were talking about, who Pete is. And I think this is kind of what we had kind of just been talking about leading into this. And Pete's a lot of things. And for me, the big part of the book was trying to understand who he was again, versus the myth and the legend, and who he really was. Because he has all these different things and all these different characters and these nicknames, and there is truth to them. It's not fair to say that some of these crazy stories aren't true, because they are true. But it's finding, like I said, that truth in there, like the quotes he makes about drinking, or the stories about that they happen, or how he did things with his eyes, and really stepping back and understanding that. To me, like, regardless Hall of Fame or no Hall of Fame, that's to me the important part of the book. And what I did was maybe helping to like understand who Pete was, and at the same time, it's also a little bit understanding 19th century baseball. And by looking at Pete, I think we can get a better understanding of the game a little bit. And I don't think we all have a very good understanding of the game, unless you're really into 19th century baseball. But it was so interesting. I mean, things that we understand now we're still changing how many balls or strikes we're going to have, the development of a pitching mound, things like that were just starting to happen. And it's neat to see players evolving and how they're kind of going with it, and how that shapes and impacts who Pete is.
Yeah. You want to go into with his last few years of him playing, and then going into his post career?
So Pete spends the bulk of his career with Louisville, so from 1882 to 1889. That horrible season that we were talking about, 1889, kind of really brings Pete's time in Louisville to an end. The Players League forms the next year in 1890, and Pete ends up playing for Cleveland. And again, he probably had some other opportunities, but he was friends with Albert Johnson, who was the owner of Cleveland at the time, or the Cleveland team in the Players League, and it was a childhood friend of his. And again, I think it speaks to the idea that Pete was much more comfortable at home or surrounded by things he was comfortable with, because he's going to leave kind of Louisville for the first time to play, and he's going to go somewhere where he was good friends with already the owner. 1890, he wins a batting title in the Players League. The Players League dissolves at the end of the year. The next year, he's going to join the National League. He starts the year in Pittsburgh, starts off pretty miserably. Pittsburgh itself was a pretty miserable team. Halfway through the year, he's released and he goes to Cincinnati. And while Cincinnati isn't that much better, Pete gets on a tear. And as I said, towards the end of the season, he was definitely threatening for a batting title. But a pitch breaks his wrist and brings the season to an end. So we kind of never know what could have been, but he ends up finishing third in batting that year, his first year in the National League. He's going to play another 2 years, and he's going to bounce around between Cincinnati and Louisville the next 2 years. And he has okay years, but it definitely seems that his health issues are starting to catch up a little bit. He's missing more games. And early on in his career, he was getting suspended, and it seemed to be alcohol related. By this point in his career, he seems to be mostly sober. It's not fair to say he was probably completely sober, because there's still some stories of drinking, but it definitely seems he put in an effort. 1890, he seems to put in a really big effort to stay sober. But these seem to be more kind of health issue related. In 1894, he only plays a couple of games, and he only does it. He plays with St. Louis and Brooklyn when they are visiting in Louisville, and he kind of only does it as a fill-in player. So he only plays a handful of games then. And then after that, he can't get any team to pick him up in major leagues. And I think part of it is Louisville wasn't interested in him anymore. And I think teams just kind of thought that, well, if they're not interested in him anymore, we're not going to take him and take that chance. And I think that as sober as he may or may not have been at the time, I think the legend and myth of who Pete was probably already kind of too much, and teams maybe didn't want to deal with it. He plays some minor league ball in 1894, 1895 a little bit, and then just really kind of that's it. I always hesitate to say he retired. He just could never find another spot to play, and he tries to play as much as he can. He's really interested in becoming an umpire, and he was actually regarded as being extremely honest on the field. But again, I think because kind of his personality, it just was something that people couldn't get past. And while he does umpire a few games in Louisville, never on the major league level, just does some different games, he can never break in. And I think that was a bit of a struggle. And I think what becomes a bit of a struggle is he doesn't know what to do without baseball. That really was who he was and defined his personality. Money doesn't seem to be an issue. His parents were fairly wealthy. His dad was a wealthy merchant. And even though he died when Pete was 13, it seems the family kind of maintained that wealth. Pete always complained about money, but it never seems that money was an issue for him. He lived with his mom his entire life. So it was never like he struggled for that. He tried to open a bar. He opened a couple different stores. He may have worked on a steamboat for a while. He was a cigar salesman for a while. He ran for political office, but none of that really kind of stuck with Pete. Last kind of few years of his life seemed pretty unhappy. His health condition seems to be kind of deteriorating a little bit more. And again, I think with some better understanding of, things like alcoholism and addiction and depression, we probably have a better understanding of what Pete was going through at the time. But he's actually institutionalized because they thought he was having a mental breakdown and things like that. And while, yes, he probably was in a pretty much a bad place, I think he was probably more depressed than some kind of real severe psychosis type thing. But he was also at the same time in a lot of pain. He had a few surgeries throughout 1905. which he's going to die in 1905. He has a few surgeries throughout that time, but nothing really happens. He's going to end up dying in September of 1905. He's only 44 at the time. But I just think he kind of had this really kind of, last few final years were a lot of pain. Never really found his place. He never married. He never had children, and whether that was what he wanted or not, but he never had that kind of live with his mom his whole life. And it just seems after baseball, he never really found anything else. And, at that time, there wasn't the opportunity. I think somebody like Pete, would have been this great person on television, talker and loud and whatever, and could have been this great, announcer or something in baseball, but there wasn't the opportunity for that. He wasn't going to, be a manager. He just didn't have the personality, and people didn't see him that way. He had written to a few teams and said he kind of wanted to be like a substitute hitter, kind of like what we think of as a designated hitter, but nobody wanted to take him up on that. So I just think it was a bit of a struggle and kind of, an unhappy few final years. Some of his close friends had kind of struggled and died throughout that time as well. So, it's kind of, like I said, he's kind of a tragic figure when it comes to that. And, even when he dies, he's still kind of remembered and regarded as this great baseball player. But again, because of the era and stuff like that, like those players are going to be forgotten as we start moving into, the first half of the 20th century. And we start having these legendary names and figures start coming in. And so then it kind of gets overlooked a little bit as well, which just adds to that tragic side of it.
Okay. I'm going to remove this off the screen so we're just us now. So yeah, I appreciate you going through all that. I mean, for anybody that's out there watching this, you made it this far through the video, please go buy his book. And I got mine off Amazon, and where else is there? It's available at.
You can get any bookseller. The publisher is the University Press of Kentucky. But I always say, look, if Amazon's your way to get stuff, go through Amazon. If you have a local bookseller, there's nothing better than supporting a local bookshop. But any bookseller, online, Amazon, whatever, you can find it anywhere you go. So, hey, okay. Here's what I'll say. I definitely didn't tell all the stories that are in the book.
Yeah. There it's quite interesting. And you don't own anything Pete Browning related at all, nothing from his no photo, no cards, nothing.
No. We were kind of talking before we started a little bit. I don't really collect cards and stuff like that. I think it would be amazing to kind of come across that. I can't even imagine what the cost or value of the old Judge Pete cards may be. And I know he had a couple of different poses. Ones I've seen those. But no, there's as far as memorabilia from him, there's there's a bat at the Slugger Museum, and there's those cards. But he didn't really seem to write. It wasn't like he left journals and writing. And like I said, seems his bats kind of have gone away. There's a few out there, so there's just not a lot of that that's out there.
Yeah, because he didn't have kids. He never married.
Yeah.
I don't know if did he have any siblings? I can't remember if he had siblings.
He had quite a few siblings. He had a number of brothers and sisters. And one of his nephews actually was Todd Browning, which if anybody's into horror films, Todd Browning was a director. I think he did Dracula, Bela Lugosi maybe, but he did Freaks, which was a movie in 1932. So we're talking in the early 20s and 30s. But he was a very famous horror movie director, and Todd was Pete's nephew, and he was younger. They seem to live near each other. Interestingly enough, Todd never marries as well. But it seems they definitely had some connection on there. But as far as obviously there's not a lot there. Todd may have been at games on some level as a bat boy, though the idea of a bat boy was a little bit different then. He may have just been more kind of hanging out at the game with Pete and stuff like that. But yeah, his family, he had a number of siblings, but it doesn't seem that any of them have kind of maintained any of that or kept anything of that. So yeah, it's interesting. Okay. There's just, unfortunately, all that history that we would love to get our hands on is not there.
So, and he passed away, was 44?
It was 44, yeah.
Yeah, 44. And he was still living with his mother at that time, correct? Yeah, so he never really had a place of his own. He lived with his mom the whole time.
Yeah, him and his mom and one of his other sisters all lived together.
Okay. And stuff. So, are you working on anything else? You got another project?
So I think so, and I think we might be moving back into the music world. and it's going to be
Okay.
another overlooked, maybe under-recognized person. So there's a singer from New Orleans named Lee Dorsey, who kind of was the mouthpiece for Alan Toussaint. If you're familiar with Alan Toussaint, he's kind of the producer and songwriter from New Orleans from like the 60s and 70s on. Lee Dorsey had a number of huge hits early in the 60s. He had a song "Ya Ya," which was number one on the R&B charts and stuff. And he has a couple albums come out that almost become more influential than they are like successful at the time. Songs like "Yes We Can" and what else am I thinking of on here? On Our Way Down, and all these songs like that start getting covered. So it's a bit of the story of Lee, but also the story of kind of New Orleans and the music scene in the era through like the 60s and 70s as well. The Meters, if you're familiar with the Meters, were his backing band at the time, or played with them a lot. He played with a lot of the people. So it's kind of the story of New Orleans music, but using kind of Lee as kind of the focal point there, because again, he's this very overlooked, under-recognized figure who, on some level has a tragic life as well. He dies in 1986. Never really kind of gets to fulfill all the potential. He would go out on the road and go tour England and Europe, and then come back and go to his auto body shop and work there for 5 years until it was time to do something again, and then he would release another song and then go back out. So he, on some level, has a bit of a tragic story like that as well. But really interesting character. So I think we're moving back in that direction there, but we're just kind of in the early stages of that right now.
Okay. All right. Well, get back on with your book. Have you ever thought about like reaching out to at a venue, like a card show, and like seeing about setting up a table and selling your book and signing autographs there?
I would love to. I'm kind of open. I kind of, again, I always talk about coming from like the music world. So like I definitely am like in that like DIY, like promote yourself, like, like slap your posters all around town kind of stuff like bands would do. So I am always up for any good way to go sell stuff and do books. And it's fun to get out and talk to people. Card shows are not my, like, I don't know that world, but if somebody kind of had said, "Hey, you want to do this or that?" I would love to talk with them. I mean, I've done things when I released the book. We actually did a show. I had some like friends who I know, some musicians. We kind of had an all-star band get together, and they played baseball-related songs, and I read from the book. So I'm always about finding different and unique ways to kind of promote and sell the book and talk about it. And it's just fun to get out and tell these stories and do stuff like this.
So you're up in Baltimore, so you're not too far away from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Or down in DC to Chantilly. So maybe try to reach out to the promoter for one of those. And I know the Philly show is like one of the biggest, one of the longest running shows. Maybe, reach out to the promoter and just be like, "Hey, I'm an author, would you mind, there, maybe they'll do like a panel thing with a Q&A or something. I don't know, it'd be kind of interesting, or maybe eventually like go to the National, because it's in Chicago this year. Is going to be in Chicago for the next 2 years after. Also, it's a 5-day show.
Oh, wow.
It's over by the O'Hara Airport in Rosemont at the, I can't think of it, the Stevens Convention Center there. I mean, it's huge. So it starts Wednesday afternoon and ends Sunday.
Oh, that's definitely an interesting avenue. It's not an avenue I thought of. I would definitely mean, if people are collecting baseball cards, they're going to be interested in baseball. So yeah, absolutely. Those are very good
everything.
ideas.
I mean, people are selling everything there. I mean, it's bats, like advertisements. There's, all kinds of stuff. I mean, one year I held Babe Ruth's game used bat that was autographed.
Oh, wow.
Last year I held the Honus Wagner T206, there. So, I mean, they have uniforms. I mean, it's just an array of stuff that goes on there,
cool.
So, I mean, maybe that'd be something to, be interested in and getting your book out.
That's a really good idea. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm going to close it out right here. If you just wait, and then I'll stop the recording, and then we'll go from there.
Sounds good.
So I do appreciate you coming on and doing this. I know we've been back and forth for a while and everything. But my time was off, but I do appreciate you being patient and everything.
It's always fun to talk, and I enjoy talking about Pete. I mean, like I said earlier, I spent all this time digging into him and getting to know him. It's fun to kind of talk about him and spread the stories about him and not just trying to sell books, but just tell those stories. I mean, I enjoy telling stories on any level. So thank you for having me on and giving me the, kind of the opportunity to do that. It's been fun.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I'll stop the recording. Thank you, Tim, again. And everybody, like, please go buy this book. It is a page turner. I mean, I don't know. It's just weird. It hit me in a special place. So thank you again, Tim, for actually writing it and agreeing to do this. And I'll see you all at the next game.
Thank you.